And these workshops really led to very fruitful, very inspiring discussions about the merits and pitfalls of taking individual lives or groups of individual lives as a prism, as a gateway into trying to shed light on larger processes, events, etc. And all of these discussions eventually led to an edited volume, which we are currently putting the finishing touches to, which will come out probably sometime next year with Manchester University Press. And there are some of the contributors also present in the room today. And I'd be happy to talk about that more, and Håkon can also definitely shed light on that if you would like to towards the end. But for now, just a heads up, look out for that edited volume, because I think many of the discussions that we're hoping to continue in the form of the global biographies, the GloBio working group, are touched upon in this volume. So from that, GloBio was born, thanks also to the involvement of Victoria, who joined us in the discussions and who has really been a driving force behind the setting up of the website and getting this first event off the ground in a pretty short amount of time. There are several events lined up that are partially still in the pipeline, but do keep an eye out for those on the website as well. There'll be at least one more before the summer. Also, a warm welcome to our core members. So you can become a member if you're not already of our group. More information on that also on the website. And with that, I think that's enough of an introduction. Håkon, is there anything you would like to add to that?
No, I think that covers it. I just want to say hi and very good to see all of you. And I look forward to the presentation and the reading and the discussion. So happy to be here.
Okay, so with that, I'll hand over the virtual mic to Victoria to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you so much. And I also wanted to thank our partners and thank the London School of Economics and the Cold War Cluster for co-sponsoring this, as well as the CUNY Graduate Center Biography and Memoir Program, which I had the honor of taking part in with Professor Bhagavan last year. And numerous other institutional partners. So we thank you for your participation and support. And with that, I'd just like everyone to know that this event is going to be or is being recorded. So please be aware of that. And when you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And we will be taking questions from the chat box, and you can do that anytime. I've also put the GloBio website address into the chat box, and you can find us there. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, someone who I admire deeply as a professor and an author, Professor Manu Bhagavan. He is a specialist on modern India, focusing on the 20th century, late colonial and post-colonial periods, with particular interests in human rights, internationalism, and questions of sovereignty. At Hunter, where he is a professor of history at the undergraduate level, he lectures on modern world history and on modern South Asian history, and offers seminars on Gandhi, modern India, and violence and ethnic conflict. His graduate classes focus on human rights and internationalism, as well as biography. His most recent book is the critically acclaimed The Peacemakers, India and the Quest for One World, published by HarperCollins India in 2012 and updated and expanded by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013. Set against the backdrop of World War II, Indian independence, and decolonization in the Cold War, this first-of-a-kind international history, based on 7 years of research in 20 archives on 3 continents, tells the story of India's quest to build consensus around the framework of human rights, to bridge the divisions between East and West, between capitalist and communist, and to create, in quotes, one world free of empire, poverty, exploitation, and War. And I'd also like to introduce the chair of the panel, and she will be looking to the chat box to moderate questions and moderate the discussion. A colleague of mine, I am honored to say, Professor Taylor Sherman from the London School of Economics, and a wonderful colleague. Dr. Taylor Sherman, her research concerns the cultural and political history of India and the transition from colonial rule to independence in the middle decades of the 20th century. Her research explores conceptions of citizenship, belonging, and the idea of minority in Indian politics, Arab and Afghan migration to and from India, early post-colonial democracy and the first elections, language politics, multilingualism, and the creation of linguistic states, violence and criminal justice in South Asia. And she is also deputy head of the Department of History. And so with that, I will turn this over to Manu, and we look forward to hearing from you. And this couldn't, of course, be a more difficult and interesting time to hear about India and about its past as it informs our present. So thank you, Manu, for being here.
Thank you, Victoria, for that generous and very kind introduction. Good evening to everyone joining from London or from wherever you might be tuning in, and good afternoon from here in New York. Victoria, Eugenia Zainovieva, Hakan Ikonomu, Alice Bryant, Shruti Sinha, and Laura Almagor have put together this important initiative which seeks to reflect on and develop the methodology and theory of biography and global history both. It is an honor to participate in this inaugural conversation of the new Global Biography Working Group, GloBio. And I'm grateful to the LSE for hosting, and to the Contemporary International History and the Global Cold War International History Research Clusters, as well as the CUNY Graduate Center's Biography and Memoir Program for co-sponsoring, and to the Universities of Copenhagen and Sheffield as well. Because of the limitations of the online format, and because so many of us are struggling with Zoom fatigue, I'm going to limit my prepared remarks to about 20 minutes so that I can maximize the time I have to speak with Dr. Sherman, to whom I also want to extend my thanks and to interact with all of you. I also want to give a quick shout out to Anton Harder, who I see is here in the audience. Hi, Anton. So I just want to make sure when I shuffle these papers, I think that might make a noise. So I'm going to sit back a little bit so that you don't hear the paper rustling as I turn the pages of this. Okay, here we go. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit was born in 1900 and lived a long, full life until 1990. Her story, thus, is intricately intertwined with that of her country. And through it, we can also tell the story of India and the world in the 20th century. She was born into an aristocratic family and grew up in Downton Abbey-esque surroundings. Her upstairs, downstairs home is actually sort of left side, right side, I suppose. Her upstairs, downstairs home run in the city of Allahabad called Anand Bhavan, the abode of happiness. Swarup Nehru, her name as given at birth, was the daughter of a powerful, gregarious, and extremely wealthy lawyer named Motilal, the middle of 3 children. She was always closest to her elder brother, Jawaharlal. Nan, as she was commonly known, was a precocious child who was schooled formally by private tutors only up to an intermediate level. But her real education stemmed from her love of reading, facilitated by Anand Bhavan's magnificent library, and through her intellectually stimulating environment and the life that followed. Luminaries of all kinds filtered in and out of the house, and she herself began international travel from the age of 5. The family grew close to Mohandas Gandhi soon after his return to India from South Africa in 1914, and through the bond they developed, grew ever more involved in politics. The early years of Nan's life was devoted to family affairs, and she married at the age of 21 when she changed her name to Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, taking her husband Ranjit's patronym for her own. Association with Gandhi dramatically altered their lifestyle. Jewels, silks, delicately woven tapestries, the finest china, all gave way to rough, hand-woven clothes and social upliftment work, especially for those from marginalized caste communities. By 1930, she entered prison for the first of 3 terms, and through that fiery experience emerged tempered and steely, ready to enter the public fray in more serious fashion. A truly extraordinary, indeed cinematic life followed as she became one of the most celebrated women from the global South in the 20th century, one of the world's most recognized and respected diplomats. Several moments from throughout her life really stand out. When she was still but a small child, she and the rest of her family were accorded a special honor by King George and Queen Mary. Later, when she was touring Europe for the first time, she was arrested for the attempted assassination of Mussolini. Back in India, as tensions mounted, she faced down angry, violent mobs, forcing them to disperse merely with the force of her personality and the power of her words. In the late 1930s, she not only found herself in Czechoslovakia during the Sudeten crisis, she was squarely in the middle of things, with Lord Runciman staying right next to her. Shortly thereafter, she stood outside 10 Downing Street as Chamberlain declared peace for our time. In India, she battled famine and disease, even to the point of personal collapse. She served as a key intellectual founding force of the United Nations and later was instrumental to the resolution of the Korean War. She became so beloved and so famous that ordinary folks like taxi drivers in the United States sang her praises. Even the incorrigible Winston Churchill was won over in the end. Back in the United States, she told President Kennedy not to go to Dallas. She became friends with Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini, and later helped resolve their complicated marriage, even as she also oversaw India's sensational trial of the century, a made-for-tabloids murder case involving a naval officer. And then, she resisted, fought against, and helped defeat her own niece, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, to end her authoritarian emergency and restore democracy. Eloquent, glamorous, brilliant, the most remarkable woman that Eleanor Roosevelt ever met. She was the first woman cabinet minister in India, the second in the British Empire after Margaret Bonfield, and the first to wield substantial power in matters of self-government and public health. She was elected president of the All India Women's Conference, where she tried to push it from elite concerns to more people-oriented ones, and from there, a host of breakthrough positions. Member of the Constituent Assembly of India, India's first ambassador to the United Nations, India's first ambassador to Moscow, the first woman ambassador to the United States, the first woman president of the UN General Assembly, additional high appointments to Mexico, Ireland, and Spain, member of India's parliament, high commissioner to the United Kingdom, governor of Maharashtra, representative to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. An extraordinary life. But this synopsis, I hasten to add, should not give the impression of hagiography. While her career was remarkable, she faced several major challenges, had many ups and downs, and did not always make the right decision, all as befits someone charting a new course. She battled depression, fatigue, and several breakdowns, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately. She was loving, but had a sometimes rocky relationship with members of her own family, like her sister Betty and her niece Indira. And while she was lauded for her prowess in the West, she was nonetheless eventually iced out as her brother's closest counsel and confidant on international matters by her long-standing competitor, V.K. Krishna Menon. Okay, now with this in mind, I'd like to share some excerpts from my in-progress biography with you. I've woven together several sections here to adapt to the needs of this format. The rationale for my selections, I hope, will be apparent immediately. Part 1. In early April 1938, Nan set out for the Hindu holy city of Haridwar in the northwestern point of the United Provinces, now the state of Uttarakhand, nestled amongst the Himalayan foothills near Dehradun. The city was and continues to be home to one of the largest religious celebrations in the world, the Kumbh Mela, where people came from all over the subcontinent to bathe in the mountain pristine aqua emerald waters of the Ganga River, the Ganges. The site was one of 4 spots where a drop of the godly nectar of immortality, Amrita, was said to have fallen, and where, in its diluted state, it was said to heal those in need in lieu of granting them everlasting life. The festival was, and continues to be, held only once every 12 years, its rarity combining with its prominence of deliverance to make participation highly valued and desired. Nan's visit was related to the opening of the great festival, to meet local religious authorities and to ask for their assistance in maintaining sanitary and safe conditions throughout the get-together. While in town, Nan also planned to open a Swadeshi, that is homespun, exhibition, but feeling happy as a child going to its first party, she suddenly found herself obsessed with the idea of immersing herself in the special waters of the region, even though her hometown of Allahabad too was bordered by the Ganges and was one of the other 3 homes of the great festival held on a different cycle. Despite her enthusiasm, she could not work out proper scheduling and had to cancel her plans to participate. Her mood soured from this, and she made the journey into the holy city scowling at all who came near her. As they neared their destination, though, the multitudes thronged all around them. Over 1 million visitors were estimated to be in the small city, and Nan found herself enthralled. Just then, a young fellow traveler from Punjab noted with alarm and disgust how some were taking advantage of the celebration for their own ends, observing that, quote, these great vulgar men were marching nude through the streets of Haridwar without any religious motive, just showing themselves off, making suggestive gestures, marching in a brazen manner, thwarting the authorities in the knowledge that they were supported by the ignorant to whom their flaunted nudity was a symbol of sainthood. And the women, old and young, rich and poor, throwing themselves at the feet of these rascals, fighting with each other in a desperate effort to receive the blessing. End quote. Nan felt jolted awake. India had many great traditions, beliefs, and festivals, but devious and deeply deceptive men, corrupt and conniving, had ensorcelled the people, enticing and then ensnaring them through trickery. She could suddenly see through the illusions. I saw before me, she recalled the next year, an enslaved people, poverty-stricken and downtrodden, their weak, undeveloped bodies being a correct outer shell for their weak and undisciplined minds. Crooks and con artists exploited ill-informed people in terrible need, feeding their own depraved cravings in the name of offering divine assistance. Quote, today India was a land divided, where brother fought against brother, where each one strove for his own selfish end, and where the ignorance and superstition of women was in no small part responsible for the downfall of the race. But a new hope was born within me, she went on. If there are quarrels, there is also unity. There is also much unity. If there is ignorance, knowledge also exists. And if superstition still stalks the land, is it not equally true that enlightenment pursues it and seeks to drive it out? As these thoughts gained coherence, so too they helped shape Nan's new sense of purpose. 2. Just as the Kumbh Mela came to an end in Haridwar, virulent cholera broke out in the city and quickly spread. Within the first few days, there were 200 cases reported, with 72 deaths. Just 2 days later, there were about 150 cases in one day, all resulting in death. The director of public health, who served under Nan, was dispatched to the city and oversaw house-to-house visits to detect cases of infected persons. Anyone found to be ill was sent to the hospital, while others were vaccinated, with upwards of 20,000 people receiving protection. This helped to somewhat control the epidemic in the city, but it failed to contain it. By the start of May, people were dying at the rate of 100 a day, primarily in the city, but elsewhere in the United Provinces as well. Within a month, the crisis was declared the worst seen in the previous 10 years, with 15,000 dead. As Minister for Public Health, Nan was responsible for the government response. In advance of the Mela, she had tried to have the population inoculated enough to reach herd immunity. Once the disease struck, she called on all available medical personnel to assist, but superstition and stubbornness kept many from receiving prophylactic treatment. Even the state's assembly speaker, Purushottam Das Tandon, refused, leaving Nan exasperated. To make matters worse, many people believed that the dead had to be disposed of in the river, which was also a site of ritual bathing and the primary carrier of cholera. Nan decided she had to intervene in a more personal way. In early July, she began touring all affected areas herself. She placed herself at considerable risk while doing so, but she thought it necessary to be able to fully understand what was happening and to allocate resources accordingly. By that point, they were seeing over 1,000 deaths and just under 2,000 seizures a week throughout the province. Acting as a field marshal, Nan surveyed the battlefield and surged garrisons of volunteers to needed hotspots, coordinating efficiently through her professional staff. Gradually, Nan's determination and perseverance began to have an effect on the spread of the, quote, terrifying disease. And after months of effort, her public health measures finally forced cholera into retreat. But the effort came with great personal cost. Fatigued mentally and physically, Nan collapsed with a near breakdown. She needed some time to recuperate and attend to her own health. 2 weeks later, she departed by air for Europe for her own medical care and what she hoped would be some much needed respite. But dramatic events were just unfolding that would make the trip much more consequential than she imagined. Parentheses. This is the Sudeten crisis. She's in Czechoslovakia, Munich Pact, peace for our time. I'm not going to talk about that. So sorry. The Ministry of, the Ministry of Health in London sent her an official letter of welcome, and the press received her with laudatory coverage. As Minister of Public Health in the United Provinces, she had to cope with the arrangements for the Mela in Haridwar, a festival held once in several years and attracting huge crowds, said one newspaper. This year, the visitors numbered over 3 million, and despite every possible precaution, cholera broke out in epidemic form soon afterwards. Mrs. Pandit earned the admiration of all India by her gallant fight against the pestilence, touring the afflicted areas, fearlessly mixing with the afflicted, and by her example, encouraging the mere men of her department to redouble their efforts. Her own health stood the strain remarkably well, but doctors ordered her to take leave immediately if a breakdown were to be avoided. So wrote the Manchester Guardian, which also ran a major biographical profile of her, complete with large picture, shortly after her arrival. Until last year, they began, quote, only one woman in any part of the British Commonwealth had ever held cabinet rank. Mrs. Vijaya Pandit is Miss Margaret Bonfield's first successor, but unlike Miss Bonfield, she holds 2 ministerial posts in the United Provinces. The story talked about Nan's pioneering work and her popularity with women, taking special note of a major initiative she had pushed through just before her departure for Europe. Quote, Mrs. Pandit recently started a training school for nurses, and when she returns, she wants to establish a nursing service for the poor and for middle-class people in their own homes, it concluded admiringly. The irony was that Nan herself needed treatment urgently. She knew it. So she decided it best not to hide her troubles in the shadows and opted to make clear herself that she was in London for reasons of health. She announced her intention to meet with the minister to study some of the departments under his supervision and to get in touch with the London County Council once she felt a bit better. Nonetheless, she attracted attention wherever she went. She was, quote, swamped by photographers as all the art editors and agency men in the country seemed determined to get their own photographs of so good looking a cabinet minister. That's the quote. She had to take the bull by the horns and so sat for a full press conference. To a room of reporters, quote, mainly of Indian newspapers, she made plain that while she was fully attuned to both domestic politics and international affairs, she was going to clear her calendar of all public engagements for several weeks in order to address the matters of her health. She felt uncomfortable with the laudatory coverage she had thus far received for being a trailblazing woman in government because it implied that Britain's provincial autonomy arrangements also deserved praise. She urged everyone to focus on what was really at stake for India and elsewhere in the world: freedom and real democracy. Those were the causes for which she stood. She felt lucky to be in the care of her friend, Agatha Harrison. Harrison was the daughter of a Methodist minister who considered herself an avowed champion of women, of peace, and of India. It was she who had helped arrange Gandhi's visit to England in 1931 for the Second Roundtable Conference. Since then, she had only grown closer to the Mahatma and to the cause of subcontinental freedom. Harrison advised Nan to enter a private nursing home in Broadstairs in Kent on the southeastern coast of England. Nan found it, quote, a delightful place, lovely rooms, good food, and absolute quiet. She enjoyed the lovely weather and spent long hours by the sea, along with visits to the nearby towns of Ramsgate and Margate. But the real highlight was a tour of the renowned Bleak House, the former home of Charles Dickens and popularly regarded as the real place behind his eponymously named novel. It was also where he wrote David Copperfield. This all struck a chord with Nan's literary sensibilities, but she was most impressed by the way the property had been maintained for the public by the government. Despite the relaxed atmosphere, Nan's health did not improve. On the advice of 2 different doctors, Nan checked herself into the New Lodge Clinic, a massive Tudor Gothic mansion with castle-like turrets situated in Windsor Forest in the Berkshires. The home had originally been built in the 19th century for the Belgian ambassador, a friend of Queen Victoria. Dark wood paneling, exquisite moldings, a richly carved staircase, and stained glass windows lent further grandeur to the establishment. Nan was tended to by Sir Arthur Hurst, a pioneer in the field of neurology, who the year before had co-founded the British Society of Gastroenterology. Although she found her accommodations posh, and managed to get to the theater every now and again, she was not at all happy. I hate being here and find it difficult to submit to hospital discipline and be treated like an invalid, but I suppose I shall have to grin and bear it, she morosely informed her husband, Ranjit. 4. Nan felt her sea legs return in early December. As she dashed with renewed vim and vigor from one event to another over the next 9 months back in India, she seemed to be everywhere at once. One of her primary concerns was expanding access to high-quality healthcare, which she now approached with new urgency. She introduced legislation to regulate the practices of medicine in the state to control common quackery and bring local options like the Unani and Ayurvedic systems up to international standards. She was attentive to issues of representation, expanding the number of women professionals, while global-minded enough to argue in favor of bringing in experts from outside the country to help train our own people. It was not incidental that many of those doctors that came in from outside were Jewish, for she was extremely cognizant of the unfortunate circumstances, her term, that they were then facing in Europe. Together with her eldest daughter, Chandralekha, she challenged long-standing customs like purdah that all too frequently kept women from getting medical help as required. This harmed public health overall, the two women argued, facilitating diseases like tuberculosis. When Nan presided over a small convention of doctors and local and state officials sometime later, she announced that the government, quote, would nominate a board to devise ways and means to counteract epidemics. Additionally, she proposed a scheme to provide mobile hospitals throughout the state so that those in rural areas could also be properly serviced. After launching one bus with government funds, she secured 3 more from donors, prodding the government to support a further 2, meeting the immediate needs of 6 districts. She then set her sights on launching 42 more. In a short time, she managed to accomplish a good deal. And she was only getting started. But that is where I am going to end. And so thank you. And I'll look forward to the conversation with Dr. Sherman and then with all of you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Manu. Yes, so I have a number of questions, which I think as I ask my questions, I think you will get a sense of my own disposition. But what perhaps the best biography, let me begin with something very critical and rather theoretical, and then we can do more fun stuff, like I had questions about her funeral, for example. But let me do something a bit theoretical and critical at the beginning. Perhaps the best biography I've read recently is by, and it's not really a biography, it's by Hélène Mialet, who's a protege of Bruno Latour. And she wrote a book called Hawking Incorporated. She followed Stephen Hawking around and charted the ways, as an anthropologist, charted the ways that Stephen Hawking was helped by lots of other people to be presented as Stephen Hawking, she puts it in all capital letters, as this person who is only a mind and who is so brilliant all on his own. And one of the most striking chapters to me was about how he wrote his single authored papers. Stephen never wrote his own papers, of course, right? Even on that machine, he wrote incredibly slowly. So he had an army of research assistants and PhD students. And what they would do is, one by one, they would sit in a first sentence, and Stephen would raise an eyebrow or get halfway through a sentence on his computer, and then the assistant or the PhD student would revise things, and then Stephen would raise half an eyebrow or construct half a sentence, and then the students and the research assistants would keep going, and that was their process. Yeah, an incredibly elaborate and collaborative process. And yet, when Hawking's name appeared on the paper, he was sole author. So this is how she shows how these people worked to create the myth of Stephen Hawking, the sole lone genius. So my question for you is, who was working to help create the idea of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit as this amazing, glamorous, brilliant woman? I suspect that her brother helped, but who else was, I mean, did she have secretaries and assistants, and who was assisting her? Who was lifting her above the shoulders of everyone else?
Okay, wow, what a great question. And first, hi, Taylor, nice to see you again. After a long time, and I hope, the one disappointment I have with this event is that we have to do it this way, virtually, as opposed to, it would have been so nice to be together in London. But well, hopefully at some point in the future. Before I give you an answer to your question, I do want to say I thought I'd written this line at the outset of my paper, and then somehow it magically disappeared in the printed version and I didn't say it. But I do want to say that my thoughts obviously are at the moment in the crisis with India. And I just want to extend my sympathy and solidarity with everything that is going on there, and hope that we will together as a global community be able to direct as much assistance as possible there, out of our own, at the very least, out of our own self-interest, because if we don't stop what's happening there as quickly as possible, it will soon come over here and everywhere else again. Okay, so forgive me for doing that. That was actually that was the first thing I had written, and it was at the start of my talk, and then I don't know what happened to it, and I deleted it, and then I couldn't find a right place to say it. So I wanted to say it at the start of my feedback. Okay, so I haven't read this Hawking biography, but it is now at the top of my list of things to do. So it sounds terrific, and I really, it speaks to a lot of things I'm interested in. There is work which is very similar, as you know, Taylor, on Gandhi, which is, there's a famous line about how many people had to work hard to keep Gandhi in poverty. And of course, there's a whole army of people around Gandhi, like sort of managing his ashrams and his diet and the farm. I mean, he does his thing, but there are all of this whole industry around him, and very, very wealthy people, including Birla, who fund Gandhi and Gandhi's poverty. So in that sense, this book on Hawking sounds, that it has a lot of parallels to those kinds of ideas. I'd say that the subject of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit is a bit unique for a couple of reasons. First, let me say that it's similar in this way. I suppose anyone who is famous or makes it is, even to the extent anyone is self-made, they have their own drive, their own gumption, they pull themselves up or whatever, but they're always helped by lots and lots of people, by their family members, by their teachers, by their community, or as Hillary Clinton put it, it takes a village. So that part is true. And I can speak to some of that with respect to her. But I also, before I do that, I think I want to speak to the fact that there were a lot of things that were preventing her and lots of people like her from making it, starting with the fact that she was a woman and it was not really seen as her place to leap into the public sphere, to take on these roles, to become important in her own right. And so, there's lots of downward pressures, and therefore there was also opposition. And to that extent, I also want to say that while there may have been an industry around Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit in her own time, there was, that there was also an industry that cropped up towards the end of her life, which was intent on erasing her from history, which is why today, the memory of her, the recollection of her is vague at best, and mostly she's seen as, she's sort of talked about as Nehru's sister. She was a diplomat, and there's lots of use of the term nepotism that floats around. I'm not convinced that any of those things really, I mean, none of that really captures her, and nepotism is certainly not the right explanation for her success or her rise. So you mentioned Nehru might have been one of her boosters. In fact, Nehru was one of the people who was often most reluctant to push her forward, because he was always concerned with showing favoritism, like the fear of showing favoritism. So he would go out of his way not to bring her up and not to praise her and not to talk about her publicly. Privately, of course, he was very fond of her. He wrote encouragingly, but if you to help provide some evidence for that claim, one only needs to look at the distinction between the two sisters. So there's Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, Swarup Nehru, and Krishna Hati Singh, Krishna Nehru, who's known as Betty. And Betty, Krishna Hati Singh, grew quite jealous of her siblings very early on and wanted to do the same kinds of things, and just she was a nice enough person, but she didn't have the same qualities and drive and capabilities. And so she never was able to sort of break out on her own and sort of catch fire. So in that sense, it didn't matter. And, I mean, she had the same kind of overall backing and structure and that kind of thing, and it didn't work for her. So I want to be clear that we have to acknowledge the merits of the person that is, and especially in this context, women breaking out of the mold and then achieving something in a pioneering way. I think we have to acknowledge that. Now, who is the industry? To your question, who's the industry around Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit? And there is one. And the first and foremost is her immediate family, who love her and they adore her and her boosters all the way through. That's her brother Nehru, who's extremely fond of her, her father, who doted on her whole life and really cherished her, rose her up, and her three children, Chandralekha, Nayanthara, and Rita. And Nayanthara Pandit goes on to become, and is still, the famous author Nayanthara Sehgal. So that's the immediate core group, and that's very important to her. She thinks of, and her husband Ranjit, sorry, and they sort of cherish her, and they have a great relationship overall. But there's also sort of more complicated things involved. I won't get into all of the details here, but she has an early love affair with a Muslim man and named Syed Hussein. And Syed Hussein eventually comes to the United States, where he's involved in an organization working for India's freedom. And there's a coalition of people here. And there's an associate in the United Kingdom called Krishna Menon. And these organizations really propel the idea of Indian freedom and anti-colonialism broadly. And she winds up on an international tour. And through this, she becomes affiliated with these groups and with several very prominent people in the United States, most notably Pearl Buck, the author of The Good Earth, and basically all of New York's power elite. They all basically just decide that she is everything. And also significantly, the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Walter White, and this community of race activists. And together, they start promoting her as the greatest thing since sliced bread. And Eleanor Roosevelt eventually, very soon after she meets her, is convinced. And so Eleanor Roosevelt also becomes like one of her great boosters. And together they start promoting her as everything. But it's way more complicated than this. It's the Cold War. And when she sort of breaks out on her own, which is late in life, she makes a name for herself by standing up to Western imperialism in such a unique way. I mean, she's got so much charm, and she's a great orator, that she does it with affection, as she's told to do by Gandhi, and that is her way also. She does it with affection, but she really stands up and she's unafraid of ripping people to shreds, in a nice way, when necessary in debate. And the Soviets just find this like unbelievable initially, and they decide that she should be promoted. So they promote her heavily in the Soviet Union through the state press and things like that. So I think that's a long-winded answer. I'll stop there, and that way maybe we can talk about it a little bit more.
Can I ask a follow-up and about the industry that came after her death? Because certainly what we know about her brother is that there was a massive industry producing the idea of Nehru as the architect of independent India almost from May 28th, 1964. So the first Nehru stamp, which I'm actually having delivered, I've become a philatelist. I'm having the first Nehru stamp delivered to me, but it was issued after he died, sorry, not after he was born. After he died, things started to be named after him massively after he died. Did the Congress Party, was she part of any of that later in her life after her retirement? And what's this sinister other force, and is it Indira, that was trying to remove her from her memory from public life late in her life or even after her death? Can we talk a little bit more about the narratives that are produced around her, the competing narratives that are produced around her, either late in her life or after she dies?
Right, so the high watermark of her career, the height of her fame and her prestige and everything, is the 1950s, while Nehru is still alive. I mean, she's on her way up in the 40s. So in the 40s, she's a international celebrity, but it still goes further up in the 50s. By the time we get to the 60s, she's a bit diminished from the pinnacle. It's not that she's forgotten by any means, it's just that she isn't what she was. And yes, you have it exactly right, that right after Nehru dies, almost immediately, long simmering tensions between her and her niece, Indira, come to the fore privately. This is all private. And I don't want to get into too many details here, just because obviously I'm still producing the main thing. But the ultimate issue is that their relationship sours almost immediately, and it falls apart. And Indira really works to push her aunt off of the stage, and not just off of the stage, but essentially like out of sight, out of mind. Now, initially, it's just private. Like this has nothing to do with anything public, really. I mean, a little bit it does, but there's a lot of private animus from Indira's side, by the way, not from Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit's side. But Indira definitely sees it that way. And then, as you know, there's an emergency in 1975 where Indira Gandhi abrogates the Indian Constitution and suspends democracy, becomes an autocrat / tyrant. And Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit comes out of retirement. Now, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit is placed under house arrest, and she's seen as an enemy of the state by Indira. And then she cowers initially, as what are you going to do? Like, you know, she's put under surveillance. Everyone is told not to talk to her and stuff. And then she comes out of retirement ultimately to fight her niece on the public stage. And she helps break the silence, which is how tyrants operate, out of fear and silence. And when she brings the full force of her personality and pulls all her international connections to start talking about things, it releases the floodgates. And again, long story short, Indira is brought down, and they reconcile at one level, but Indira never forgives her, never. Not for that. I mean, like, you know, they get on, but that is the end of all of it. And she holds a grudge, as she was known to do, Indira, and she wiped her out completely. And so if you go visit, I have, the museums that Indira herself was responsible for, like Anand Bhavan, the house where she lived and grew up, and where she did where Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit grew up and stuff. Indira also lived in that house, but Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit lived there before Indira Gandhi and did many things before Indira Gandhi as well. She's like, other than like 2 pictures in the background, she's nowhere. And like they just, and I can state this, and I can't go into the details, but this was purposeful. So, when I started, so this is my biography of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, but the Peacemakers, which Victoria alluded to in her opening remarks, in that book, that was the first time where I sort of told a bit about her story in that book. And to be frank, when I was doing it, I myself was surprised. I was like, wait, what? Who is she? Like, why is she doing this stuff? Like, I had never come across this in all the stuff that I had read, in doing a PhD and, being a specialist, I didn't know. And then I was even more surprised to find out when I started talking about that book in lectures and so on, that most people had no idea. And so I think that's where you saw the impact of this, and it was part of a larger erasure of a lot of that story. So that's in a nutshell what happened. There is, I do want to say, by the way, a stamp of Vijay Lakshmi Pandit as well. Actually, I think there's 2 stamps.
Issued sometime after 1984, I presume.
Yeah.
When Indira was killed, for those of you who don't know that reference. So I have a different set of questions, which is about workload, right? Really this idea that she was everywhere, that she was probably the patron of so many different organizations across India, and involved at the international level, and how she managed it. So Nehru, of course, famously wrote 4 or 5 hours of letters every evening, although he probably didn't write them, his secretaries wrote them, right? But he answered letters for hours every evening. Were he alive today, he would have been on WhatsApp all the time, no doubt. But I wanted to ask you, but I feel like the sheer volume of things that Nehru was technically involved with, that his opinion was required for, that he had to help remove barriers for, and help assuage egos to get things happening. I think the sheer volume that he was involved with makes me skeptical about how intimately he was involved with all these things. So I'll give you an example from just after independence in August 1947. He was asked to be the chair of the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, so the CSIR, and he says, yes, I'll be the chair. I'm not going to do any of the work. I don't expect to do any of the work. I'm going to hand it all over to SS Patnagar, who knows what he's doing. He'd already been made mostly in charge of that. But Nehru said, I know that by associating myself with this organization, I lend it prestige, and I show how much importance I give to it, and therefore other people might treat it with more respect. It might open doors, etc. And so my question for you is about Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit and all the things that she was involved with. How intimately involved with them was she? And I'm talking about the height here, about the 50s, really, because I'd have no doubt that as Minister of Public Health, even if she also had local government to deal with, that she was genuinely involved with helping to quell that cholera epidemic in the 1930s. What about the 1950s? Is she too busy to be too deeply involved in all of it?
So I think that there's a distinction between her brother, who is a global celebrity, but also the prime minister, and her. She's a global celebrity in a very different kind of a way. And so when she's asked to do things, as far as I can tell, not only she takes the job seriously. But I will give you one example where I think it does illustrate your point, where she gives speeches, where she shows up and attends meetings, where she is interactive. Obviously, someone, you prioritize. Her primary jobs were as this is where I think the key difference is. Her job was as a diplomat. That was her primary portfolio in the 40s and the 50s. And as a diplomat, her job is to make appearances and make people happy and sort of sell India, right? So if she shows up at a dinner, she's working, and she's working hard, because that's the job. But there's obviously more to it. Diplomacy is more than that kind of stuff. The parties and that kind of thing are important. That's part of the circuit. But you negotiate difficult deals, and sometimes there's a real crisis that needs solving, and there's a hot conflict that has to be put out. And in those sense, she's involved intricately, intimately, and in great detail in whenever those kinds of issues really occur. She's there, and she also is. There's a couple big famous episodes where she's a debater, and she's the primary person, and she's doing the work. Now. She also holds a whole ream of titles at various times, one of which is she's in the Constituent Assembly of India. The Constituent Assembly is a great example of what you're talking about, where she is in the Constituent Assembly. This is the body which is created in order to draft the Indian Constitution before transfer of power, and then after, and then through that period, ultimately. Before the document is completed, and then it goes into effect. So she is a member of the Constituent Assembly, but is only ultimately able to really deliver one important speech. She shows up, she visits, she sits in the gallery, she listens, that kind of thing. But at least so far, I haven't, that isn't what her attention is on. So she, now, to be fair, when she is unable to devote attention to something, she quickly feels guilt about it and tries to leave it, like to say, like, I can't do this, and she'll move on. She is associated with all kinds of, you're exactly in this sort of similar way, for prestige reasons, or because they want to involve her for her input or whatever. She gets associated, but it's different than Brand Nehru. Brand Nehru is, the prime minister is affiliated, Nehru Anna, he's the greatest, that kind of thing. Let's have his name imprinted on the top, and we'll be fine. Her thing is more, there's some of that, but there's also let's hear what she has to say, and she gives her input, and then she sort of moves on. I don't find too many ceremonial kinds of positions, and I do find instances, for example, where she's asked to do something like what you're talking about, ceremonial something, and she declines. She just is like, no, I can't do that, and doesn't do it. Yeah, so it's a little bit different than her brother. Yeah,
that's to be expected. That's good. That's very interesting. Thank you. So I have one last question, when I'm going to say that out loud, so that people who do have questions can prepare their own. And you can either raise a hand or put it in the chat if you don't want to put it in the chat. So my last question for you is about her funeral. I find that, so I'm writing a book at the moment, and I can't really I have to kill people to know them. And so I always find the day they died and look at their obituaries and find out what their funeral was like and how they were spoken about on the day. I found very interestingly, Ambedkar, when he died in 1956, no one important attended his funeral. The governor of Bombay left Bombay to go to Delhi on the day of Ambedkar's funeral. I mean, he was really snubbed. So I'd like to end, so by the time Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit dies in 1990, Indira is long past. Of course, her sons are in charge. what's her funeral like? How is she mourned globally or in India? And what does that say about India in the 90s, really? Or on the cusp of liberalization?
So good question. What I've seen, and I must confess, I haven't written about this part yet, and I hadn't really looked at it from your angle. But I will say that I have looked at the obituaries. She gets some coverage. There's international press coverage of her. Obviously, by the point she dies, she has faded from memory. She isn't what she was to people in the West. So the Western obituary, I'm pretty certain, but I can't say this with 100% certainty, that there's a New York Times obituary. I recall reading it, but I can't be certain that it's not before me. And now I just because of how I operate, I don't want to guarantee that this is what I read, but I think so. There's a Times obituary for her. And there, there's a couple people who were talking about it. I do want to clarify that after Indira died, she had a good relationship with Rajiv Gandhi and with his children. So she sort of recuperates some of that. And that was because she was never really the source for the animus. She wanted a good relationship, as far as I can tell. Now, I want to be clear that there is a biography of Indira Gandhi by Catherine Frank. Victoria knows it because we read that for our class. And in that book, according to Catherine, I should say Miss Frank because I don't know her, she says she portrays Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit as the villain all through. I mean, she's the clear foil to Indira Gandhi, and she's the villain all the way through. And I must tell you that I have not found anything anywhere that really matches that characterization from a third-party perspective or from any internal document I've seen about the relationship between them, not just from Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's point of view. Now, it doesn't mean that isn't what Indira Gandhi was thinking internally, and so maybe Ms. Frank was able to pull things together beyond things I've seen from Indira Gandhi's perspective. But I think either way, the concluding point would be that's more from Indira's perspective. In terms of the funeral itself and thereafter, I don't know is the short answer, other than to say that Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in the 1980s, right before she died, was still giving interviews in her 80s, where she was, as observant, as astute, as at almost any time in her life. I mean, it is remarkable to watch those interviews, which some of them are digital, and she's still sharp and still able to talk about things. And so people are still interviewing her. Obviously, at that point, it's faded glory. It's a reflection of things. It's a reflection on things. And to be clear, in some of those ending points, she's not she's not full of ebullience about where things are. So that's sort of what I'd say. And of course, Rajiv Gandhi gets assassinated very shortly thereafter, after she dies, and then the country takes a different turn. I would say that regardless of what her death meant in 1990, that where the world has gone since then, to my mind, if anything, illustrates the importance of her legacy and her life, and that many of the things that she went through at an individual or personal level, as well as her own conclusions about things, her own take on things, the actions that she took, I think that they suddenly feel to me, as I'm doing this and nearing the end of it at last, timely, relevant, and resonant to me. Like, I'm always shocked at how compelling it feels. At one point, it's my job to help translate that for everyone else. What I'm feeling about the story, I have to try to do that in my writing. And so that readers of my work can feel what I think I'm feeling. They can disagree with it, but they should at least sort of try to feel that. I mean, that's what I'm hoping to accomplish anyway. So that's where I'd leave it, Taylor. I think that's a good question. I don't have a good answer for it. I want to be clear. Like you made me, now I'm going to finish this and I'll be like mulling over this for the next 6 months, but which is, I think, of course, the purpose of a great question. So thank you.
Great. Well, I've enjoyed this back and forth, which was entirely planned. And now Manaswini is going to help us set off on the larger. Oh, good. We've got 3 questions. So what I might do, if it's okay with you, Manu, I might collect a few. Is that all right?
Yes, of course.
So I see 3 questions. So I'm going to call on Manaswini first, and then I'll do Anton, and then Tom, and then Vicky. Well, let me do 2 and 2. So Manaswini and then Anton.
Hello, good afternoon to Professor Bhagavan, and good evening to everyone in the UK. Thank you very much for this amazing talk. I'm a doctoral candidate at American University in DC, and as a political science student, it's always great hearing from a historian because my dissertation has a lot of historical research work. So my question, Professor, is about your craft of research. So during the course of researching this book and using archival resources and working on your chapters, how has that helped form your opinion about what we see in India right now? So this history being so contested and being rewritten, and the Nehru dynasty being vilified for political purposes. How do you see what you're working on tie in with what's happening now? Thank you.
Great, very fair question. And Anton.
Hi everyone, and hello, Manu. Nice to see you. Having I don't think we've ever communicated, well, virtually. It would be great to see you in person, of course. But anyway, good to see you almost in person. And thanks for the talk. So my question. So I mean, you alluded to this in the talk, or it was alluded to that perhaps the peak of her fame is in the 1950s, and a lot of this is to do with her diplomatic role. What I'm curious about, because I remember that after I don't remember, but I've read that after the war with China in 1962, she's there really quite passionately defending non-alignment, even in December 1962. I'm curious what she was operationalizing, Nehru's foreign policy, if you like, in all the roles she had. I just wonder what she contributed maybe conceptually also to that in discussions of what, India's posture should be. And then kind of related to that, I'm curious in terms of her working relationship with her brother diplomatically as a sort of prime minister and foreign minister, and as this, the most glamorous ambassador India had. Did they? I think it's right that she disagreed with the way he responded to the in 1956 when the Soviets went into Hungary. She disagreed with the approach he took. I'm just wondering whether there were other instances where they did actually differ. Thanks.
Thank you.
So we'll go back to you, Manu, and then I'll take some more.
Oh, you want to finish?
No. Why don't you answer those 2, and then I'll go back for more questions.
All right. Manaswini, thank you for that question, which will take me the rest of this entire presentation and also into the next 2 years to answer. Wow. Okay, so the question is how do I feel about what is happening now and the role and relevance of history and what I'm working on in the attempt to erase Nehru's legacy, and rewrite history, and I mean that's the package of questions as I understood them. And what I would say is that, and it's a craft question, so I'm going to answer it from a craft perspective as opposed to a political one. I would say that I see my role as a historian to be a historian, to work on my craft, to ask important questions, and to theorize if the paper or the book involved is theoretical, or to use archives and that kind of thing if the work is intended to be empirical, or sometimes it's a little bit of both, and to sort of craft work based on that material. I don't take sides on the theory versus praxis debate. I feel like I do a little bit of both things, but I would say that at a very general level, the objective is to analyze and grapple with history. Now, Edward Said has made it very clear that the role of the public intellectual is also a political one, and that you cannot just sit on the sidelines. There's no such thing as complete objectivity. We all have our own subjectivities, and therefore there's a politicism to everything that we say and everything that we do, and every way that we that we act, everything that we read, everything is a text and everything has meaning. And so I would say that it's important to try to be true to that. So from my perspective, I think that there are certain ideals which I think it's important to subscribe to, and that we shouldn't shy away from subscribing to them, which is to say that if we do, as if you have a certain set of ideals. For me, I strongly believe in democracy. Now, as I believe in democracy, it doesn't mean that everything about democracy is perfect. And it doesn't mean that democracy should not be interrogated, because it cannot create serious problems of representation, questions of how people fit into a system, and how best to ensure that people are able to see themselves in the state. If I were to say to you that I believe broadly in concepts like fraternity, equality, and liberty, and then say, but I don't mean the French Revolution, I mean it in the Ambedkarite sense, where Ambedkar specifically uses these three concepts and disentangles them from the history of the French Revolution and sort of projects them back into the Indian past, I would here be illustrating the way that there are all of these kind of complicated issues historically, which are contested then as they are now. And so, okay, there's a complicated Byzantine craft answer, which means that I think that at the end of the day, I am opposed to the faulty use of history for political purposes. I am opposed to the use of history to benight communities who are minorities in states. I am opposed to the political manipulation of the past for the purpose of distinct political projects, which themselves are dubious in many ways, and that they use this to legitimize themselves. And that I am opposed to the use of things like history detached from the science and profession and craft of history, that is, like concocted fantastical notions of the past. And so I am for, therefore, sort of a meaningful grappling with the past, using many different methods, acknowledging, of course, that the professionalized notion of history that we sort of associated with the classical West is not the only meaningful form of history, that there are many forms of history as well. Manu Sweeney, that is a very long-winded and windy, twisty answer that I think, I hope, addresses what you were asking. And if you want me to answer it from a political point of view more directly, I would be happy to, but I think you asked a craft question. I'm going to stick to that answer. Anton, so for Anton and I are collaborators. For those of you that don't know, Anton produced an amazing chapter for a book I did on India and the Cold War. And he has some affiliated essays elsewhere, and is amazing and terrific to work with. So Anton, it's great to see you virtually and to get to chat with you. And as I understood your question, it was about, how much does she disagree with her brother? That was the end. And if there was something else in the middle that I'm missing, just let me know. And the answer was
that was the second part in a way. Yeah. What did, because she's there putting into practice the India's way diplomacy, but what did she contribute? Right.
Oh, sorry. That's the most. Let me answer that part first. So the question is, what did she contribute intellectually to the formation of India's foreign policy, if at all? And the answer to that question is that I gave a talk on this at Oxford right before the pandemic hit, where I went into this sort of elaborately. So I would say that she contributed quite a lot, way more than we credit her with, and way more than is clear in sort of straightforward records. So it requires a little bit of parsing, but I made distinctions in that talk, which is online if you wish to hear it further, where I hope I was clear in that there's all kinds of reasons why someone like her is not always credited. It has to do with the nature of the archive and the nature of records and what counts as intellectual and political thought. Is it in the form of a specific tract, a book, something like that, like her brother? Or is it more in the form of diaries and correspondence and things of this, and small speeches, which he did those things too, but for someone in a more informal position like she, you have to sort of go through all of that in order to collect it out, and then you have to track the impact of each of these things in various ways. So in a nutshell, I would say that she is very much part of the conversation. It's very difficult to sort of constantly piece, did she say this first or did he say this first, and sort of always figure out the exact origin of each thing. The fact is that they're constantly talking amongst themselves, constantly. And through letters and in person and through their family and their networks. And so it's clear that she is saying things that sometimes are her own ideas that then he sort of carries forward. Sometimes they disagree, and sometimes the two of them are arguing over something, and then she takes his stand publicly. So all of those things are happening. I'd also refer you to the person who invited me to Oxford, an Oxford student, Sharani Jagtiani, who is outstanding and has completed a dissertation, which I think grapples with some of these kinds of questions. And so I might just have a look at that. Okay, then the follow-up question, which is related to this, is does she ever disagree with her brother? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. And she disagrees with him, and sometimes publicly, from early on. So before he's Nehru the Industry, or Nehru Inc., or some variation of Victoria's the comment she made in her first question, that Taylor made in her first question. I would say that she, in Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, in some ways, she could be more left of her brother in some ways originally. And she, for example, had more sympathy for the Congress socialist position as opposed to the Congress position in some places. Then there are other distinctions. She becomes very fond of the United States, like extremely fond of the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that she agrees with them politically all the time, but she sees a lot of value in it. And in that sense, her feelings for the country is a bit different than her brother, who always felt more out of place in the United States than in some other places, but she felt quite at home here. Then she would later say that the United Kingdom was a place that she felt most at home, and I think she sort of felt most comfortable there. He had those kinds of feelings too, outside of India, of course. I mean, India, this isn't to say that they didn't feel at home in India, they felt at home in India, but as she had to feel at home someplace else, these were important elements. So they had disagreements on things like that. Then in terms of, you're right, you quote this important thing at the end. So after the Sino-Indian War, Nehru is broken, and he's very upset at what's happened, and he starts to doubt himself. And she is, full blazes ahead, still committed to defending the ideals and the principles, and she maintains that all the way through the rest of her life, as far as I can tell. That idealism never diminishes. She feels skepticism for the direction that the country is taking, and she feels skepticism for politicians and the choices that they make, but she holds true to her mind, to the ideals. I want to be clear that people, if it's not very hard to find them, have written critical things about her, that saying that there's this disjuncture between her claim to these ideals and some of the ways she herself presented herself or carried herself, things that she did, for example, that she was into fine things, even as she would talk about, like, high-minded Gandhiism. And those are true, but I don't find anything of value to those statements. That what she's doing is, when she did those things, was in keeping with her positions, which was as a diplomat, and that was part of how she traded on her success. But those are assessments. To your question, the simple answers to your question, Anton, did she play a role in political intellectual thought on her own right, as opposed to just carrying out what her brother said? Answer, yes, and unequivocally so. And B, did she disagree with her brother at times, publicly or privately? Unequivocally, yes.
Oh, very clear answers. Thank you. I like the summary at the end. Tom Wilkinson is a PhD student at the LSE, so I'll take a question from him and then from Laura.
Thank you, Taylor, and I've been really looking forward to this event, so thanks very much for such an interesting talk, Professor Bhagavan. And my question is, you've given us this really interesting glimpse into how Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit was at the very center of these Indian and global events and processes, and how she was the first of many things. But I wanted to ask, in this biography, where does the kind of norms of everyday life fit in? And maybe that's a kind of more general question for writing a global biography. But how do you, or is it even necessary to focus on, to some extent, the norms of everyday life, or that kind of vast space in between, being at the Sudetenland or being at outbreaks of cholera at the Kumbh Mela? And how do you go about deciphering that interiorized selfhood rather than the more exteriorized persona that a diplomat often has to project and politicians often project? So that's my first question. And just one other second brief question as well. How would you describe Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit's relationship with Gandhiism as a set of ideas or as a philosophy? And I ask that because her relationship to some extent is, she documents that in her autobiography about her experiences at Anand Bhavan, and she talks her personal relationship. There might be something known about that. And in terms of her brother's personal relationship with Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru's relationship with Gandhiism as two contrasting set of ideas, and those shorthands have been very much used in the study of Indian history and been very popularized by books written by Partha Chatterjee and Benjamin Zachariah. But yeah, how would you describe Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit's relationship with Gandhiism as a set of ideas and a philosophy? So they're my two questions. And once again, thanks for such a brilliant talk.
Very big questions. So I'll let Manu digest those a little bit as Laura asks her question.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Manu, really for introducing me to someone that, to my shame, was not well known enough to me. So really, that's a great takeaway from tonight. So I was also very happy with Tom's previous question, especially the first part. And I would like to take that even further and ask you a real GloBio question, maybe the GloBio question, namely, why a biography? And now, obviously, this is a figure that is so important, whose life is so extraordinary, and who personifies the connection between all kinds of big world events. But and that could legitimize the choice for a biography, and that's pretty convincing. But could you take that a bit further? What do we get from this biography? And maybe one proposal, and there could be many more, but just to maybe push you in a certain direction. What can we make of the fact that she's a woman politician, also from the reception point of view? So judging by everything you've told us, for instance, the reference to the Manchester Guardian, this open attention to her health and her public breakdowns, the fact that she goes into the cholera pandemic affected area and is there as a kind of mother figure. How relevant is it that she's a woman, both in her own times, but also setting a sort of precedent for Indian politics, or maybe even beyond Indian politics for the years to come? Is that maybe one way in which we could take this question of why a biography even further? But you can take it in a different direction as well. Right? Just an invitation to reflect maybe a bit more explicitly on the methodology that you've chosen.
Thank you, Laura. And sorry, Manu, I think Vicky is going to ask a similar question, I suspect. And so I'm going to let her jump in before I let you answer, if that's okay.
Taylor, you suspected correctly. And mine actually is a little more detailed than Laura, but also getting to this question. I'm fascinated by networks in biography. And I was wondering if you could speak to, you spoke about Eleanor Roosevelt, but also, you know, I'm thinking Claire Booth Luce, my favorite Eleanor Dulles. And I noticed when Martha Graham went to India that there was a real concern in the United States Information Agency that was not true, say in Japan, that Graham present herself as a professional woman. So, you know, what kind of opportunities or contacts were made between women who we might not know anything about, who were sent as professors or with whom she engaged, you know, globally? And if you're looking at it from that point of view, what does the research look like, and how did those women tell you something about your woman?
Okay, over to you, Manu.
Okay, wow.
I will say we hit midnight in about 3 hours here, so you know, I do appreciate you've got a lot to answer.
Okay, thanks, Taylor, and thank you for the 3 questions. Tom, I just want to say thanks for the questions. Have we met? I feel like we've met somehow, or maybe interacted on social media or something to Tom Wilkinson.
Maybe on Twitter. Yeah, not in person, sadly, but on social media, I think potentially. Okay. Yeah.
Well, nice to meet you virtually. Finally, I think I've seen your name somewhere, but anyway, it's nice to meet you virtually. Thank you for the questions, which are both great ones. So the first part of your question was about interiority and exteriority and the everyday and the life. So I just want to say that to me is often the most interesting part. If I just sat and wrote about all the big events, as I did in the brief outline at the beginning, you know, and no one wants to read a resume, like that's on Wikipedia. Like we know what the big things are. What I think is important about a biography is exactly what you said, and almost in those words. It's about this constant relationship between the interior and the exterior, and you know, how do you turn the envelope inside out and then right side back, you know, constantly, so that you can see what's going on in multiple registers. So that is my answer, which is that the answer is you need to do this, and you need to write a biography in multiple registers. That's the way I've approached it, which is you have to talk about the everyday. And so I have all kinds of mundane things, like having to do with her tea schedule and cooking and flowers and, you know, like worrying about a house, you know, stuff like that. But I try to do it in a way which, you know, I mean, no one wants to sit and read tedious shopping lists either, like, oh, she went and she bought, but you want to try to blend these things together. And you also, like, you know, how she interacts with her immediate family and the joys of everyday, you know, another thing that to me, a biography can help to fill versus other kinds of history is that, oh, I'm going to get myself into trouble. I think that we really try to understand big events in the past, and we spend so much time. Why did they make that decision? Why did this thing happen? And we sit and look through records and lectures and speeches, and video. I'm just going to ask all of you real quickly. Victoria will know that this is my MO from class. If you just close your eyes for 1 second, close your eyes for 1 second. Think about what we all did yesterday, and now try to rationalize why did we do each of those things yesterday? When was the last time we had an argument with someone who we're very fond of? If we ask ourselves, why did I have this argument with this person? We can't answer. We don't know why we did that. Why and why not? Because, and the issue is not because we don't know. The issue is because there is a distinction between rationality and emotion. And that we have reasons for doing things, and yet we can also act impulsively and be driven by emotion. And to capture those elements, those contours of impulse, inner drive, and emotion is something that I think the everyday, that like just learning about those things, the small things that give joy, the small irritants, you put those things together, then you have a much fuller picture, a much better understanding of why someone acts the way that they do. Then I said in a speech that I'm going to do this, and therefore I did this. I mean, I think that that's important, but I think that the rationality is important, but it's the impulse control and emotion that are also part of the whole package. So to me, that is the piece that the study of biography largely, and by biography, I don't just mean like a life, the narrative of a person, and there are many kinds of biography, the lives of ideas and the lives of whatever. This is something that I think this particular kind of methodological approach helps us to understand both historically and ergo in understanding ourselves at any present moment. Okay, so that's my answer to that. The second question, Tom, about Gandhi, whew, there's a lot of questions to go. The second question about Gandhi is, what was her relationship with Gandhi? It is a relationship that changed, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details here because that's something that will be in the book, but she had a very complicated relationship with him very early on. But grew to have the like utmost respect and fondness for him. And he winds up being essentially a surrogate father figure to her, or grandfatherly figure, but really fatherly figure. She has the utmost respect and affection that develops over time. And this is an interesting case example, Tom, especially vis-a-vis your original question, because she doesn't buy into the myth of Gandhi. That is, in fact, the whole point. She completely thinks the opposite early on, and then over time, she comes to appreciate him at multiple levels and to appreciate his greatness. Whether or not she agrees with him all the time is besides the point. She doesn't. But she sees she definitely concludes that he's extraordinary and that he is great, and that she should seek out his advice. Even if she doesn't agree with it, she finds solace in the way that he talks to her, and that the approach, the advice that he gives. And sometimes she doesn't agree with things and she goes along because he says it. And sometimes she's like, okay, well, we have to take that with a grain of salt, but it's him and it doesn't matter because I feel 1,000 times better because he talked to me. And that's all that I can say about that for now. I mean, I have lots to say about backhands. That's what I'll say for this moment. Okay, Laura's question, Glow Bio, why a biography? And I'm going to answer this in three ways, and then the last part will segue into an answer for Victoria as well. So the first is, I'm just going to tell you why I'm writing this biography, which is going to seem ridiculous, but it's the personal and true story, which is that I finished writing my last book, and that's The Peacemakers, in which she features. And then I was starting to do some other project. I won't tell you because I don't want the person that I pulled out. I didn't do the thing I said I was going to do, and I don't want to make them any more mad at me than they already are. But anyway, I was supposed to do something, and I was struggling to get myself to be committed to doing that. And I had a conversation at home with my family, and I was just saying, part of the problem is that what I really want to do is write a biography of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. Why did I say this? I have no idea, to my point to Tom a moment ago. I don't know. I said it. That's what I felt at the time. And I felt compelled to do it. But I didn't say that to anyone outside of my family. And then I don't know, like months later, I got an invitation from a press to please write the biography of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. Out of the blue, I don't know, that just happened. And it was exactly what I wanted to do. And so I was like, I cannot believe this, and yes. So that wasn't, I know, Laura, that wasn't what you meant by your question, but I like the story, so I thought I'd share it. So that's the why part. Now, why? What I think you mean more seriously, though, is why a biography of this person? Not because of why I want to do it, but why should there be a biography of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, and why should people read it? And then attendant questions around what are the gendered aspects that are involved of her career? What does it mean that she's a woman? And all of these kinds of issues. So I just say that the fact that she's a pioneering woman is central to the story, that she's constantly breaking down barriers, and that she constantly has to address this very question. What does it mean to you that you're the only woman in the room? What does it mean to you that you are able to sit and debate with XYZ grand poobah of whatever, who's a man? And her answer is kind of always the same, which is she kind of shrugs and she makes a quick quip about the fact that, you know, something about, I mean, whatever, she's very quick-witted about how to handle things, and she will make a joke about it and move on. And sometimes she could be quite eviscerating in the answer, which is like, for example, and I won't go into the details here, but somebody once told her that they presumed that she would have been great at her job as a cabinet minister in terms of accounting, in terms of like managing the accounts and so on that she needs to do as a cabinet minister, because as a homemaker, she was responsible for managing the house budget. So, I mean, I love this story. So she like looks at this guy, I mean, you know, and she practically makes him melt just with the stare she gives him afterwards. And then says in the most kind of joking kind of way, which is she couldn't manage a house list to save her life. She had never managed any kind of house budget, and if anyone had trusted her with anything, it would have all fallen apart. And she doesn't handle the budget part here either, that's handled by her staff, who are men, and that they answer to her, which she then asks important questions about, and to make sure like she can understand it at that level, and she sort of processes those kinds of things. But the key thing here is about management and these kinds of things. And then she talks about what her strengths are, which is a complete reversal of the premise of the question. And so it's done in kind of a funny and friendly way, but by the end of this, I mean, the person who asks her this is just utterly like left humiliated in the room. I mean, you know, she means it nicely, but the result is the same. She doesn't mean it that nicely. I mean, she means to put him in his place for asking such a stupid question. So that I think is an example of the way she grapples with these kinds of issues throughout her whole life, and how she has to kind of confront it. So the book, therefore, is very much about this question that anyone who's a pioneer, women everywhere, always have to answer, which is, you know, why are you here? And the book tries to say, how dare you ask that question? You know, like that's the premise. And it sort of goes through with all kinds of issues that are involved with that. Why should people care about her, other than the fact that she's a pioneering woman, and other than the fact of resume? As I think the reason why I made the selections I did, so those are all pieced together from different parts to tell that sort of tied together story for the reading I did today. I just think that, as I told you in an earlier answer, I think that there are elements of the story which I just cannot believe are true, because they just feel like they are meant to be read right now, and that they are speaking to us right now. And so I think that there is just a timeliness to the whole story, which demands for it to be written and demands for it to be read now. And I think that there are issues involving gender, involving power, and involving international relations, involving domestic politics, involving who is an Indian, and what is a global citizen, and what is the role of international bureaucracy in crafting global peace. What is the nature of a national security in the face of national interest, which compulsively drives us to competitive situations with other powers and ergo conflict. So, I mean, I think these are the kinds of big questions which her life answers and is testament to. And I can't think of bigger questions than those that we need to deal with right now. So why should there be a biography? Because she straddles the 20th century and she is us now. So last question to Victoria. I mean, to come to the last question that was asked by Victoria, which is about networks. This is a fun question, and I don't want to answer too much. Victoria, as you know, since I wrote to you about this just recently, Martha Graham herself makes an appearance in the story. I mean, the thing is, what is that famous thing? 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? Like, we can play this game with her. 6 degrees of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. I mean, like, literally, I feel like I can connect anybody, anywhere, somehow with her. She has this, I mean, it's just extraordinary, really. I'll give you an example. Alexandra Kollontai, Russia's first major female diplomat, first female diplomat, and in fact, one of the first women diplomats / neo-ambassador in the world. She knows her. I mean, like, they have this whole, you know, interesting relationship in Moscow. I told you already, Pearl Buck and Eleanor Roosevelt. Martha Graham via Isamu Noguchi. Rossellini, Isabella Rossellini, and Roberto. But really, I mean, honestly, Victoria, I'd just reframe the question, which is, who is it that she doesn't know? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, like any celebrity that I can sort of find or think of, somehow she meets, and whether, especially if they're political. So yes, you're absolutely right. What about Claire Booth Luce? Yes, Claire Booth Luce is very important to the story. Claire Booth Luce is a good friend of hers. Sorry, for those of you that don't know, Claire Booth Luce is a Republican member of Congress, whose husband is Henry Luce, the founder of Time and Life magazines. And Claire Booth Luce is an Indophile who also ultimately is very fond of Nehru. And so they have a very productive relationship. But Mary McLeod Bethune, anyway, Victoria, the list is endless. It is very, very lengthy. You can name a political celebrity. You can name celebrities, Hollywood celebrities, Indian celebrities, global celebrities, writers. Like, for example, Somerset Maugham makes an appearance. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. So part, I mean, like, obviously, as you can tell, I'm fascinated by this. And so one little, fantasy version of the biography is just to sit and do, like, it's one of those bulletin boards, like conspiratorial bulletin boards with yarn and lots of pins, and let me connect how it all fits together. And she's like at the center of this bulletin board. Like, that's one sort of fantastical way to imagine this project. And I mean, obviously that would be nutty to do, so I'm not doing that. but it is.
Show us the rest of your office, Manu. I believe you have that board just behind your computer in your office.
All you see is what's on camera. That's it. But yeah, it's those pieces, I think, are fun to think about. And it's how you sort of relate all of that. Like, what does it mean that she knows all these? How can she be so connected and so, like, ridiculously tangential and central to so many people, and yet to, like, 10 years ago, maybe 12 years now, I don't even remember anymore now. Time is all blending together, and whatever, it's been 2006, a long time ago, not that long ago. About 15 years ago or so, I didn't know anything about her. I knew something very vague, like, like undergraduate lecture style, what I would put into some notes to deliver, like that. That's it. I didn't know much beyond that about her. A very, like, again, like a quick resume understanding of who she was. I didn't have much depth. I mean, there's her memoirs, and I knew about those, but I just didn't have a good understanding about her at all. And how can that be? That's the question. How can that be when I'm looking at who she was and what she did and who she knew and how central or tangential she was to, like, whatever, again, the bulletin board. And I come to erasure and amnesia and some of it is willful amnesia, and some of it is purposeful, and some of it is because she's a woman, to come back to Laura's perspective, Laura's question. Yeah, so those are my thoughts on those three questions.
Great, and it's really not that close to midnight either. So I would normally cut us off here, but we have Shruti waiting, and she is an LSE student and has been part of this project. So Shruti, I give you the honor of having the last question.
Hello, Dr. Bhagavan. It's finally good to see you virtually, hopefully in person soon. So I am actually writing my thesis on Indira Gandhi, but when she was the official hostess of India, when she wasn't prime minister at all, so prior to her prime ministership. And in 1960, she was elected as a permanent executive board member of the UNESCO. And even, of course, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit has a similar leadership and a much bigger leadership role in the UN. So this question you brought up about being a global citizen is something that I've been thinking about a lot. That these women were getting recognized in international organizations, and they were taking up positions there and had views and opinions and were passing resolutions and all of that. But what did it mean to be a world citizen as a woman of color in a new in that too from a newly decolonized country um, at that point of time? A B So in 1966, I remember looking at certain articles when Indira Gandhi became prime minister, and the articles were from the Guardian and the New York Times, and they were like, oh, obviously, she had to become prime minister because India has had a legacy of strong women who, like Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit and certain other women who have anyway taken world leadership and national leadership and have been on the forefront. And India is not a patriarchal country at all, unlike the West. So, and that really caught me by surprise. And I was like, there's this one idea of how these women come from such a unique background, which is very, very limited to just their family and certain families around them. So how does that sort of play into the way others were perceiving like India, and how, I mean, this whole perception about India is not patriarchal because there are these women who are taking up leadership positions. So obviously India had to have a woman prime minister.
Taylor, should I jump in?
Sorry, yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, Shruti, it is finally so nice to meet you virtually. Shruti and I have had exchanged correspondence over time, and so I'm glad to have an opportunity to finally meet you and interact with you a little bit. And you've been so kind and in the messages, so thank you. Okay, great questions again. What does it mean to be a global citizen for Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, and in the context of decolonization and as a woman of color? I love this question. I think it's just terrific, and it really gets to the heart of so much, and it comes back to some of what the other folks were asking. Anton, to your point about does she ever disagree with her brother? Now, this answering Shruti's question is one in which we can separate out and see how these sort of, you can have two things happening at once. So Nehru himself, as you know from my book, the last monograph, was an internationalist, and he sort of really believed in some of the problems of the national state. And so there was a globalist aspect to his worldview and philosophy, particularly in the late 40s and 50s. But he's prime minister. So at the end of the day, he has to operate a national state. Now, he may be working towards, fraternity, international fraternity, XYZ, however it might be conceptualized. But for him to outright say, I'm a world citizen as opposed to a citizen of India, is a different kind of a statement. She uses that term. Let me be clear. She uses the term, I am a citizen of the world. And so that is a big distinction. And it is a way in which she's able to make manifest the vision that they have and that she's supposed to be operationalizing, but in a way that her brother cannot and does not. And so there's some context that's really needed here to answer this question, which is, there is talk about what a global citizen is. I'm gonna, I can't think of his name now. I can see this gentleman's face, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. There was a New York person who declared himself the first citizen of the world. Oh, I'm so mad that I can't think of what it is now. Gary? Gary something, I think. There, well, I mean, I don't want to repeat all the stuff I've written about before, but Wendell Willkie had sort of pushed the idea of one world dating back to the 40s, an American Republican candidate, and there was a World Federalist movement. So there were World Federalists around, and many of them, there were prominent World Federalists who included people like Albert Einstein, Albert Camus, Albert Schweitzer, and all of these folks who were advocating things like this, and they were obviously they were prominent across multiple disciplines, and there were all other famous people who were also quite interested in these kinds of concepts, who were elites. And who were operating in sort of a global intellectual sphere of this kind. So what did it mean for her to get up on the stage and start talking about this? Well, to them, it meant a lot. And so she's recognized right away in the 1940s by the World Federalist movement, who she's a part, for example, of a celebration of the concept when the organization is recognizing the New Yorker magazine for an essay by E.B. White. E.B. White is the author of Charlotte's Web. In that sense, she is, it's difficult to put into this kind of synopsis, which is why the book will be kind of the thing. You know, that she is like heralded across the board, left, right, and center, white, brown, black, you know, people just come to her like they follow her. They are impressed by her. They most of all, they appreciate her at a human level. She's just warm and funny. And they like her personally. And then through that personal connection, she's able to develop, to sort of overcome political barriers, oftentimes. Now, again, I want to be careful because you know, when I say things like this, and I feel like I've said a lot of this throughout almost all my answers, you know, she's imperfect. She makes mistakes and people do get mad at her. I don't want to pretend like that's not happening, that's happening plenty. But she has a remarkable way of sort of overcoming a lot of that, and people appreciate her. So the global citizenship part is because she develops relationships with national figures from multiple parts of the world. She travels around the world, and she has a long relationship with Madame Chang in China. She travels to the Philippines. She travels to Indonesia. She's throughout the West and everywhere. And you know, I mean, to that extent, this is the hallmark of a great diplomat. She wins friends wherever she goes, and that's why she was so good at her job. What did it mean for a person of color or a woman to be that pioneer? I think that's a great question that requires more investigation, which to me, for my part, I'm hoping will come through via the narrative of what I am telling, but analytically is something that then you know, really needs to be grappled with in a variety of ways, because I think that there's a whole lot to it, and it's not just something where I can say she once said this and she had a lot of friends. I mean, that's my answer for right now. But I mean, I think that the point is that sorry, something's happening. But the point is that she hang on, I lost you on my Zoom. I don't know what happened.
You're still with us, Manu.
With us.
Okay.
We have
okay.
you.
Okay. Oh my, I just saw I'm really over time. So thank you to everyone who's still here and for staying. I would just say that global citizenship is something that is talked about in the public sphere by intellectuals. It does have more traction than people imagine today. It is a more popular idea in certain parts of the world. So the other thing is just because in the United States, you have like a reactionary element which takes over in the 1950s, which pushes back against this, does not mean that's how the rest of the world feels. So there is more of sort of a sentiment about trying to build bridges and the commonness of humanity. And in the context of nuclear annihilation, this is a very important concept. How important is Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit as a woman and a person of color, as this sort of global representative? She's tremendously important to lots of parts of the world because she stands in as a representative of what can be, of what the future is. She's a symbol of the future. That's true in many decolonizing parts of the world, and it's pushed by advocates like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson in the United States, who are running these internationalist organizations and who are central intellectual figures on these kinds of concepts, like Pan-Africanism, for example, that sort of pick up on some of the things she says and builds forward. African-American race justice advocates, to answer one of Taylor's first questions, are key to the industry that helps build up who Vijay Lakshmi Pandit is on the global stage. And I didn't say that earlier, but I think that's important takeaway. And Shruti, to end our thing, I think your last question, which was, oh wait, actually, sorry, can you just restate your last question for me, please?
My last question was the fact that there was a perception about India and India not being patriarchal because these women were, sort of coming out and,
Right. So this is a very interesting kind of thing because some of that impression comes from the fact that, to again, coming back to what Laura had asked me, when Vijay Lakshmi Pandit is abroad, one of the things she's struck by is how, to her, quote unquote, I'll put it differently, how when she's abroad, she's surprised by how much women in the West do not participate in the public and political spheres. By contrast, it was true that the larger number of women were participating in South Asia at the time, and she credits this to breakthroughs during the anti-colonial movement, but with, she sort of makes claims about their older lineages here and there to whatever, but she recognizes that there's sort of a breakthrough moment in the anti-colonial period. And so she says, though, that women in South Asia therefore seem to pay more attention to these kinds of things than women in the West. And she also takes note that when interviewers in the West ask her stuff, they always begin by focusing in on what she's wearing. And she sort of makes fun of this. And again, back to some of the points that Laura raised. And so she goes off in a different direction. And so whereas she feels like in South Asia, when she's asked these kinds of questions about whatever, it's never about, oh, what sari are you wearing today? Or why are you wearing this? Nobody ever asks that. They just get to the point. Why did you think this? Why did you say this? So when she's giving interviews in the West, she promotes the idea that this is her experience. So I can see very much how the conclusion, therefore, is, oh, India is not like this, India has this, and of course, there's going to be these breakthrough positions. And I can see how it can flow from what she's saying, even though I wouldn't think that she was, she's not saying exactly how it's interpreted, but when you sort of read the pieces together, you can see how people can easily conclude it. Obviously, it is preposterous to say that South Asia or India is not patriarchal. Or at any time that was true. Obviously there are many lines of patriarchy that have run through, and that was something that she herself was challenged by in many ways. I think that the takeaway, though, is that this is about differing impressions and opportunities, and there was obviously certain kinds of class breakthroughs which she, for what it's worth, and again, this is more of this is in the book, but she was very attuned to those differences. She was very attuned to the keys that her privilege gave her to open doors. And she knew that she was given those keys, and many people from other class backgrounds and caste backgrounds were not given those same keys. And so she was determined to try to help break that down. She would talk about it, she would create initiatives and so on. You know, I mean, I can't say that she was very successful, but she did use the platforms that she had to advocate for a much bigger doorway and more keys and more pathways and to break down these barriers. And I do deal with that in the book. So Shruti, I hope that answers your question. I just want to say to all of you who asked questions that thank you. And I tried to answer them as best as I could in the limited format, but that let me acknowledge very quickly that I had to give because of, for all kinds of reasons, one of which is that you all must be tired of hearing me talk already, is that I didn't want to get, you know, to each one was so good, each question was so good that they would have led to very, very lengthy interactions and exchanges. And this would be the perfect point at which we would then break and go off to have you know, further conversations over tea and then dinner and whatever. So I really regret not having that opportunity for conversations to carry on in a more informal way from this. But I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak at the LSE, and for all of you for putting together this great initiative on GloBio and for having me.
Thank you.
Manu. I enjoyed. Thank you in the normal way, in the Zoom silent clapping way. Your enthusiasm is infectious, if it's okay to use that metaphor. It is, and I'm sure are all looking forward to the book. I certainly am. I'm going to hand over to Vicky to tie things up and send us off.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful and inspiring session, conversation. Thank you to Professor Bhagavan. Thank you to Professor Sherman. Wonderful questions. Thank you to all of you who stayed. We went over, and I can't thank you enough for your generous offering of your time, expertise, great discussion. And here's to 2022 and some tea in London and more discussion. Thank you to GloBio, thank you Laura and Hakan, and to all of the people who made this possible, Shruti, Alice Bryant, Eugenia Zanova, and our partners, London School of Economics, and then the GloBio partners. Thank you. Truly an honor.
Bye, everyone. Hopefully see you in person soon.
Thank you, Manu. It was wonderful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hakan. Thank you. Can I log out?
Go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.